The house was quiet, save for the gentle tapping of rain against the windows, a sound that usually brought comfort but now only seemed to amplify the noise in my mind. I stood at the counter, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold, stirring absent-mindedly as my thoughts pulled me into a place I'd fought to avoid. The air in the kitchen felt heavier tonight, as though it carried the weight of all the emotions I'd tried to ignore. My heart felt tangled, a confusing knot of feelings I couldn't untangle, and maybe didn't want to. He had been a part of my life for as long as I could remember, marrying my mom when I was still young. Back then, he was a steady, dependable figure, someone who made me feel safe without ever needing to say much. Tall, strong, and exuding a quiet confidence, he became my rock, the person I turned to when everything else felt uncertain. For years, his presence was a constant, a source of comfort I never questioned. But recently, something had shifted. There was an energy between us now, subtle yet undeniable, that changed the way I saw him, and maybe how he saw me too. It wasn't just the lingering glances or the way his voice softened when we spoke. It was something deeper, unspoken, that I didn't know how to explain, even to myself. The sound of his footsteps broke the silence, soft but steady as he entered the kitchen. I didn't need to look up to know it was him. His presence always filled the room in a way that was impossible to ignore. There was a warmth in the air now, subtle but undeniable, wrapping around me like a blanket I wasn't sure I wanted. "Still up?" His voice was low, familiar, comforting. He stepped closer, the space between us shrinking until the quiet felt even heavier. My heart skipped as I glanced up, meeting his eyes. Those deep, steady blue eyes that had always felt like home. But tonight, they seemed different. There was something in the way he looked at me, something searching, as if he was trying to find an answer to a question neither of us had dared to ask. I tightened my grip on the mug, suddenly aware of how close he was. "Yeah," I said quietly, my voice barely steady. "I couldn't sleep. Just thinking." His gaze didn't waver. "Anything you want to talk about?" he asked, leaning against the counter beside me. His tone was gentle, but there was a quiet curiosity in it, a weight that made my chest tighten. I hesitated, unsure if I could put my swirling thoughts into words. My mind raced, but the space between us seemed to shrink even further, the tension crackling in the air like a distant storm. I glanced down at my tea, watching the ripples shift as my fingers trembled against the mug. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it, and I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of speaking or of staying silent. "I don't know if I can." The words slipped out before I could stop them, soft and uncertain. He shifted closer, his warmth brushing against me as he placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You know you can tell me anything," he said, his voice steady, quiet. "I'm here for you, always." I looked up at him then, drawn by the sincerity in his voice. His hand lingered, its weight both grounding and electrifying. He'd said those words to me countless times before, but tonight, they felt different, as if they carried a meaning neither of us fully understood yet. Taking a shaky breath, I forced myself to meet his gaze. "I've just been thinking a lot lately. About us," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of the confession. His expression shifted, surprise flickering across his face before it softened into something deeper. "Us?" he repeated, the word hanging between us like a fragile thread. His hand slid slowly down my arm, the touch sending a shiver through me that I couldn't hide. I nodded, unable to say more, the fear of what this could mean locking the words in my throat. But I didn't need to. In the quiet that followed, the unspoken emotions we'd both tried so hard to ignore filled the space between us, making it impossible to pretend any longer. For a moment, neither of us moved, the weight of my words hanging in the air like a fragile thread stretched too tight. Then he took a small step closer, his hand lingering on my arm before sliding down to my wrist. The touch was gentle, almost hesitant, but it sent a warmth through me that I couldn't ignore. "I felt it too," he admitted, his voice low and thick with emotion. His gaze held mine, steady yet vulnerable, as though he was searching for permission to step further into the unknown. Slowly, he reached up, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face, his fingers grazing my cheek. The gesture was so tender, so intimate that my breath caught in my throat. "What does it mean?" I whispered, barely audible, my words trembling under the weight of my fear and desire. What are we supposed to do? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his thumb traced the line of my jaw, his touch soft but deliberate. I don't know, he murmured, his voice almost a whisper, but I can't pretend anymore. My heart thundered in my chest as I leaned into his touch, his warmth grounding me even as it made me feel like I was on the edge of something vast and terrifying. His face was so close now, his breath warm against my skin. The space between us disappeared, and before I could second-guess the moment, his lips met mine. The kiss was tentative at first, as if we were both testing the limits of what was happening, but it deepened quickly, the weight of years of unspoken tension melting into the connection. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I let my own hands find their way to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my fingers. It was everything and nothing all at once, soft and electrifying, hesitant and consuming. In that moment, the rest of the world seemed to fall away, leaving only us and the storm of emotions we could no longer deny. As the kiss lingered, a quiet passion building between us, the weight of what we'd just crossed into began to settle. When we finally pulled apart, our breaths mingling in the stillness of the room, his hand remained on my cheek, his thumb gently brushing against my skin. His gaze was searching, filled with questions neither of us dared to ask. "What now?" I whispered, the words trembling with uncertainty. He exhaled slowly, his expression a mix of longing and restraint. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely more than a murmur. "But this changes everything." The silence stretched between us, heavy but unbroken. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, as if the world carried on, oblivious to the shift that had just occurred in ours. I felt a pull in my chest, equal parts exhilaration and dread, as I realized there was no going back, no undoing this moment. He stepped back, his touch slipping away, and for a brief second, the warmth of his absence stung. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice soft yet filled with a quiet resolve. "Together." I nodded, though the uncertainty still loomed large in my mind. The house remained quiet, but inside, my thoughts swirled louder than ever. This was uncharted territory, and I didn't know where it would lead. All I knew was that something had shifted between us, something that could never be undone.